So tonight I want to delve a little more deeply into biology, which is an absolutely amazing and fascinating subject. Now, having been trained in the physical sciences and maths and physics, of course, I had the greatest of contempt for biologists as a student because after all, biology was no one has got a clue what happens inside a cell, really. So I just had to get that out there early on. At least as an engineer, I had a rough idea what we were doing with the spacecraft. But I don't think we see God's creative handiwork more clearly and spectacularly than in living cells and living systems. You know, the Bible says, as Carl read in Psalm 139, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. You see, as we look at how God has made us, it should elicit a response of praise for what a glorious creator he is. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Now, I have an Australian translation of Psalm 139. And the last little phrase says, it's flippin' obvious. And it's true, as you look around and look at living systems that are capable of replicating themselves, there is nothing that man has made that comes even faintly close to that. Well, where did man come from? We read in Genesis chapter 1, and then God said, let us make man. One of the early references to the divine council, the Godhead, the Trinity, present there right in Genesis chapter 1. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Now, friends, I shared a little bit last night on the complexity of a cell, and I want to dig a little more deeply into some of that tonight and to show you just how remarkable God's creation is and how, frankly, hopeless the attempts at explaining it in naturalistic terms really become. So here we have just a rough conceptual diagram of a cell. This man, Dr. Michael Denton, was not a Christian when he wrote an amazing book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And as an evolutionist, it was a wake-up call to his community of biologists to say, guys, this theory that we are teaching in our universities is in a crisis. And he has some marvellous quotations in that, including this one: to grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometres in diameter and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. We would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. Amazing. Now that is giving glory to God from a man who was an atheist at the time. I don't know if he still is, but you see, when we look at living systems, our response should be to give praise to the creator of those things. Now, inside the living cell, there are all kinds of incredible things. I shared a little bit about some of them last night. But there's a postal service that operates inside every cell in your body. Now, this postal service is a little machine. He's called a motor Kinesin. And he's a linear motor, and he marches along a long strand of proteins called a microtubule, and he carries a sack of proteins which have address labels on them that have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to fulfill the cell's functions. Now, once again, with the aid of amazing imaging technology like electron microscopes and other techniques, we've been able to see just exactly what these little linear Kinesin motors actually look like. And I want to play you an animated clip that gives you a little glimpse of this incredible machine. Now, bear in mind, there are thousands of these zooming about inside every cell in your body right at this very instant. If they were not, your cells would not be functioning. So what you're going to see is greatly slowed down from what actually happens inside the cell.
Inside a living cell is an amazing transportation system. Proteins have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to perform their intended functions. This animation, based on a lot of clever research over a number of years, shows how it happens. Highways made of microtubules are assembled by interlocking proteins, each manufactured in accordance with the coded instructions on the cell's DNA. Marching along a microtubule is the Kinesin motor, the hero of our story, carrying a huge sack of proteins to be delivered to a predetermined place in the cell. Here, the proteins will be released to fulfill their functions. A Kinesin linear motor uses 1 ATP to provide the energy for each step and takes 125,000 steps to cover 1 millimeter. This amazing machine shows all the hallmarks of design.
Now, how cool is that? I'm not too sure about the little dance routine he gets at the end there, but you know. Amazing, 125,000 steps to move just 1 millimetre. And that little guy zooms about, delivers his sack of proteins. That microtubule, by the way, gets dismantled behind him, and then a new path is established for the next task. Incredible. And yet, our good friend, he's a good friend. Here he comes. Richard Dawkins says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Friends, I'd like to suggest to you that that is a real statement of faith. It really is. In fact, I think atheists have tremendous faith. It is so much harder, I believe, to really convince yourself that all of nature came about by chance than it is to believe that there is a creator God. So is there purpose? Well, let's look at this building that we're in. You know, it didn't come about by some kind of explosion somewhere in a building equipment factory. It was obviously designed. People brought these steel frames along and it was erected in accordance with some plans. There was information. I talked about information a little bit last night. And remember, we had to have a predetermined code. Remember that? If you don't have the predetermined code, then information cannot be transmitted. But information and the code is non-material. Now, I want to just elaborate a little bit on that because people get a little bit confused about this information argument. So here I've got a string of 21 letters and spaces. And it actually means absolutely nothing. But if you rearranged those letters, you could come up with this: she has an automobile. Now that has quite a high level of information. It's telling me that there's a human female who owns a car. But I could rearrange, well, not rearrange those letters rather, but using 21 letters and spaces, I could say this: Sue has a red Porsche. Now I know which human female and I know what kind of automobile. And I'll probably want to get to meet Sue. But this has the highest level of information. But can you see that there's exactly the same number of letters and spaces? So the number of letters and spaces does not determine the amount of information. It's how the letters and spaces are arranged. That is the key to information. Now this is often misunderstood, and people will try and argue that all you need is random processes that generates lots and lots of random letters, and that's information, but it's not. You see, that last sentence has the highest meaning of all of them, and it's all about how you arrange the letters and the spaces. By the way, just on the theme of having the correct code, does anybody know what that means? Now, if you don't happen to be able to read Chinese, you won't know what that means. I can't read Chinese, but somebody who can tells me that it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So let me just try and elaborate a little more on this. Imagine you're eating a bowl of alphabet soup, all right? And you dip your spoon into the soup and out comes this. Now, do you think that's likely? Now, you can actually calculate the probability of that happening, and it's in the order of 1 chance in 10 to the 20th power. I mean, it's a stunningly unlikely result. But friends, on the human DNA, there are 3 billion letters of coherent information, arranged so that you exist and I exist and human beings can reproduce. And as we saw last night, all of that information is stored on this incredible molecule called the DNA molecule. Now, it's the most efficient information storage system in the entire universe. If I were to take a pinhead, now take this like a hat pin with a round end on it, and if that was full of DNA, and I were to write all those instructions in a book, how high do you think the pile of books might be? I mean, no one's going to have a clue, but let me tell you, it would stretch from here to the moon 240 times. That's in the head of a pin. Or if you recorded it all onto discs, then you'd have a stack of discs 1,800 kilometres high. This is absolutely staggering. And information, of course, as I shared yesterday, is needed to specify living organisms. Remember, we talked about this single-celled bacterium. It would need, say, a book of about 500 pages to record all the instructions for assembling that bacterium. But if you wanted to make a horse, a more complex creature, you need more information. Information about making muscles and tendons and heart, eyes, brain, and all the rest of it, as we talked. So here we would need many, many more books full of information. Now, here's the catch. You see, if you believe in the atheistic evolutionary story, i.e. there's no God and the universe got here by accident, including you and me, then you have to believe that from that first living cell, that bacterium, we've made this progression from that one book to many, many, many books full of information, all through random processes. So we have to add books full of information by chance. Now remember that soup spoon? Are you happy? Not much chance of that happening. But now you've got to add many, many volumes full. So where does all this information come from? Well, people have put forward various suggestions, and in fact it was Charles Darwin who assumed that it was the process of natural selection which was the mechanism by which simple organisms became more complex and that we generated more and more information. Now, we're often told in biology courses and what have you, and certainly on television documentaries, that natural selection is the engine of evolution, and in fact it's synonymous with evolution. But I want to share with you how natural selection works. So if you'll come with me on something of a thought journey. So here we have 2 dogs. The first step is to assume they're dogs. Big step. But these 2 dogs have medium length hair, and the reason they have medium length hair is they each have a gene for making short hair and a gene for making long hair. Now if they're codominant genes, then the dogs will have medium length hair. Now we can breed these 2 and produce puppies in a variety of ways. This first little guy gets the short-haired gene from each of his parents, so he has very, very short hair. These next 2, they're like their parents. They get a long-haired gene and a short-haired gene, so they have medium-length hair. But this little guy, he gets the jackpot, and he's got a long-haired gene from each parent, so he's a very hairy little dog. Now let's imagine that this population of dogs, this little family, moves to a very cold country, high latitude country, lots of ice and snow and sleet. Well, the short-haired dogs and the medium-length-haired ones will be selected against by the environment. They won't survive, they're not well adapted. But the long-haired ones will stay nice and warm and they'll survive. Now if those 2 should fall in love, then they're going to produce some puppies, but guess what? Every single one of them will have long hair. But can you see what has happened here? You see, there's been a loss of genetic information for making short and medium length haired dogs. So what's actually happened in natural selection is it has reduced the genetic information. So natural selection goes the wrong way. It's downhill, right? But remember what evolution needs? To go from simple to complex, we need to add genetic information. Natural selection reduces it. Now, the very best you might do is rearrange it, but natural selection does not generate novel genetic information. See, natural selection is not creative, and the evolutionists recognise this. So a long time ago, 1905, Hugo de Vries said, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. In other words, where did the organism come from? And here James Shapiro, in a recently published book, points out, very rightly, that selection operates as a purifying but not a creative force. But hang on a minute, we need to create novel genetic information to go from a simple organism to a complex one. Selection isn't getting it there. Now, you've probably seen this kind of diagram. It's very common in biology books and evolutionary texts, and it depicts the Galapagos finches that Darwin made famous. And he observed that some of these finches had long, thin beaks, and others had very short, fat ones. But it's been determined by observation that as the climate varies across the islands and the food supply changes, so the proportion of finches with narrow, thin beaks might increase and the thick beaks decrease, and then it shifts back the other way again as the food supplies vary. So what you're seeing is a change in gene frequency, they call it. But you see, none of those variations actually explain how the beaks came in the first place. We're observing variations in existing genetic information, not the creation of novel genetic information. Now, one of our speakers who is actually retired from CMI now, but who was a biologist, recorded this short interview as a part of our DVD on evolution's Achilles heels. Many of you will know Dr. David Catchpole. Let's listen to his first grasp of this issue.
The first time that I saw a creation presentation on natural selection, I was just amazed at my blindness prior to that, in not realising that natural selection can only operate on whatever is existing, and it can only operate to remove what is existing. And so the realisation that it doesn't actually produce new genetic information was an absolute bombshell to me.
So, friends, natural selection does not cut it as a mechanism by which genetic information can be generated through natural processes. So people came up with the next idea, well, maybe mutations do it. Now, mutations are abrupt changes to the genetic code, and if perchance that abrupt change produced some trait that was beneficial to the organism, then perhaps through natural selection that could become locked into the population. So the current theory is that is how organisms progress from simple to complex. But let's just have a little look at what mutations really are. And here we have Nature Education Knowledge saying, mutations are essential to evolution. Every genetic feature in every organism was initially the result of a mutation. Well, that's the claim. But the problem is, mutations are random changes to existing DNA. So can random changes add information? So here we have a quote from Carl Sagan, who's a very outspoken evolutionist, of course, very famous man. He passed away some years ago. I guess he's a creationist now. But he said this: mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It is rare that a precision machine is improved by a random change in the instructions for making it. And friends, we know intuitively that is so, don't we? I can assure you that if you made random changes in the instructions for constructing a communications spacecraft, you would not get a better product out the factory door. Mutations are copying mistakes. I wish they were called that, because then people would understand it better. I could write this simple sentence and make a couple of careless errors. Have I added information? Well, of course not. You see, errors almost always delete or corrupt information. And certainly random copying mistakes can never account for the encyclopedic quantities of information required in the DNA to go from simple to complex. Now, here's an example of a mutation. Now, this little creature is a rooster that has had the instructions for making feathers switched off by a mutation. Now, if you were the chook farmer, you'd think this was brilliant because now you don't have to pluck the chooks, right? But if you're the little chook, I think you'd have a different view, wouldn't you? But you see, there is no new information here, simply a loss of information. Now, this has a technical term. It's called the TNR mutant, and that stands for a totally naked rooster. I think scientists, some of them, should do that creative writing course that Mike and Jenny son was undertaking. But there's confusion around because people say, but there are beneficial mutations. And here's an example. A little beetle that might have wings finds itself blown out onto a windswept island near the mainland. Now, if some of its descendants have a mutation which deletes the wings, so it becomes a wingless beetle, on the windy island it will fare better because the ones with wings will fly and then get blown off into the ocean and drown. And after a while, we end up with a population of wingless beetles on windy islands, but on the mainland, their cousins all have wings and fly. Now, that's a mutation that is beneficial because now the little creature survives. But it doesn't create new information. Okay, that's the distinction that is so important. So, mutations don't cut it either. Friends, there is actually no mechanism by which genetic information can arise through natural processes. Now, this question was put to Professor Richard Dawkins, our good friend again. And this was the question. Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome? Now let's think about this a minute. Here you have the world's champion of evolution and natural selection and so on. So he's asked a pretty fundamental question because this has to be the way in which simple organisms become complex through natural processes. So, Professor Dawkins, can you give us an example? And I want you to listen to his answer to this because it's very important. So here's the question. This is an extract from a DVD called From a Frog to a Prince.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Now, I would suggest to you that that answer is very eloquent. You see, there is no example because it can't happen. It actually was worse than that. It went on for some 20 seconds. He then asked the cameras to be stopped, and then he came back on and he answered a question other than what was asked. And you can find the whole transcript of that interview on our website. Professor Dawkins was asked, has evolution been observed? And he said, well, evolution has been observed, it's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Now, in fairness to Richard Dawkins, what he means is the process is so slow that in any one lifetime you would never expect to observe evolution occurring. But it is kind of revealing, isn't it? Professor Werner Gitt, who's an information theorist, and we have a lot of his articles, materials on our website, says this: no information can exist without an initial mental source. In other words, information is by nature a mental and not a material quantity. What that means is information comes from an intelligence. So right at the very beginning, the Creator wrote into the genetic code of every living organism all the instructions necessary for that creature to live and exist in this world of ours, including, I might add, with foresight that there would be a fallen world. But that now raises the question of the origin of first life. We touched on this briefly last night. It's called chemical evolution. And Professor Paul Davies, who I've quoted a number of times, says this: nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organised themselves into the first living cell. Now, he's not saying that he doesn't believe it happened, he's just saying no one knows how. But you see, it's not just a question of getting the bits and pieces together. I mean, you could imagine this laptop of mine forming itself accidentally, perhaps. I mean, somehow or other the screen, the keyboard, the power supply, the motherboard all come together and bang, there's this laptop. But even if we granted that as a possibility, it would still be useless because it's not only hardware. What else does this thing need to be of any use? It needs software, doesn't it? It needs an operating system. So Davies goes on and says, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? You see, friends, every single cell operates under the software control encoded in the DNA. Where did that come from? Now, if you've studied biology, you want to study biology here? Any biology students? Okay. You probably would have seen textbook explanations of how the DNA code is read and transcribed and translated, and the diagrams look something like this, and you'll see these strings of letters, and then there's a thing called an RNA polymerase which transcribes the DNA code onto a messenger RNA, and then that is translated through a ribosome plus transfer RNA molecules into a string of amino acids which then forms a protein. Now, that makes perfect sense. Can you see why I didn't like biology when I was younger? It's virtually meaningless stuff, isn't it? I mean, I just glaze over looking at that. But once again, with the advantage of extraordinary imaging technology, we can actually see what happens with the transcription and translation processes in synthesizing or making a protein after having read the instructions on the DNA. So I want to play this little clip. It's narrated by a guy called Rob Carter, who's a geneticist who works for us in the US. And this is also extracted from the Evolution's Achilles Heels DVD.
One of the most amazing information transfer systems in a cell involves the way proteins are encoded in and decoded from strands of DNA. Starting out with these long, fragile, sticky strings of DNA, an amazing machine called an RNA polymerase zips down the strand, opens up the coils, and copies the DNA into another molecule called RNA. An RNA uses a slightly different language convention. It still has 4 letters like DNA, but instead of A, C, G, and T, it has A, C, G, and U. The RNA then leaves the nucleus and another amazing machine attaches to it. It's called a ribosome, and it is in charge of translating from the language of the RNA with its 4 letter bases to the language of proteins with their 20 different amino acids. 3 bases on the bottom of the tRNA match to 3 letter groups in the RNA. On the other end are amino acids which pop off as they're attached to the growing protein strand. But the process isn't finished because most proteins need help folding properly. And that's facilitated by little molecules called chaperones. They attach to and protect the unfolded protein as it's transported to a watermelon-shaped molecule called a chaperonin, which folds the protein into its final form. From DNA to protein is an incredibly complex process that uses precise and complex machines to translate between 2 completely unrelated languages, the linear code of the DNA world to the 3-dimensional code of the protein world.
How absolutely amazing is that process? Isn't that stunning? So there you have now a folded chain of amino acids. It's a protein. Its shape is critical. It now gets transported to whatever its function is. It might be part of a liver or an eye or a bone or something. Extraordinary process indeed. Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, who's not a Christian, said this: the probability of the formation of just one of the many proteins on which life depends is comparable, now get this, comparable to the solar system packed full of blind people randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes and all arriving at the solution at the same time. Can you imagine what that might look like? You see, friends, no one in their right mind truly could believe it. But when you are philosophically committed to rejecting God, then you have no other choice than to come up with some desperate attempt at explaining it. And so here's a desperate attempt. This is George Wald. Well, given enough time, it will almost certainly happen at least once. Time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Wow, so time is the hero. Well, let's check it out. How much time would you like? Well, how about the entire 14 billion years, presumably, of the Big Bang history of this universe? And there have been estimated there's about 10 to the 80th atoms in the entire universe. That's the number 1 with 80 zeros after it. I mean, that just blows your mind away, but you can imagine the number of atoms in the universe is just staggeringly large. Now let's imagine that each of these atoms represents an experiment, and they're happening 1,000 times a second. Right? Every single atom in the entire universe for the entire history of the Big Bang. So how many experiments are there? We can write all those numbers down, and I got a calculator out and I got an error. So what you have to do is use a scientific calculator and do it properly, and you end up with 4.4 times 10 to the 100th power experiments possible in all time. Okay, in all time. Now, let's think about the probability of making a relatively simple protein. Let's say it's just got 300 amino acids. Average kind of run-of-the-mill protein. Actually, it's fairly small. Let's make some other assumptions. There are only 20 amino acids available. There are actually more than that, but 20 are used in living systems. That they're optically pure. Remember we talked about right and left-handed last night? Let's say they're all left-handed. Somehow or other we just selected only the left-handed ones, and they form bonds without enzymes, and that's another massive concession. How many possibilities are there? Well, you take these 20 amino acids, and you can there are 300 ways you can arrange them. That's 20 to the 300th power, which turns out to be 10 to the 390th power. Okay, how many experiments did we have? 10 to the 100th. That means the chance of forming one protein in the entire Big Bang history of the universe is one chance in 4.4 times 10 to the 290. Now, that means probably, absolutely nothing. And very few people comprehend these kinds of numbers, even mathematicians. Now, I have a MasterCard, and it's protected with a 4-digit PIN. Now, in Australia, our financial institutions believe that a 4-digit PIN is sufficient. So what's the chance, if I gave you my MasterCard, of you guessing my PIN in one shot? Anybody know? 4 digits. What's the chance of getting all 4 correct in one go? Anyone know? 1 in 10,000, right? So the first letter is, you've got one, first number 1 in 10, next one's 1 in 10, next one's 1 in 10, next one's 1 in 10. Multiply them all together, 1 in 10,000. So what's this number then? 10 to the 2. That's equivalent to guessing a 290-digit PIN in one shot without a mistake. Now think about that. What does that tell you? That tells you that not one protein could form by chance anywhere in the universe in all time ever. It's completely ridiculous to suggest. Well, George Wald again. Well, I think maybe he sort of got the hang of this, because he said, one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Hallelujah, he got it. But wait. Yet, here we are, as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. So he has overridden his acknowledgement that it's impossible, and he overrides it by sheer faith. In Romans 1:22 it said, professing to be wise, they became fools. You know, back in the middle 1800s, Louis Pasteur formulated what we now know as the law of biogenesis, and that is that life only originates from life. That's what we observe in science. We never observe non-living materials producing living organisms. And let me share this quote, another one from Paul Davies. We are almost as much in the dark today about the pathway from non-life to life as Charles Darwin was. Well, friends, I would suggest to you we are much more in the dark than what Charles Darwin was. And why? Because we know so much more than what Charles Darwin knew. Now, I'm just watching the time. I would love to share so much more with you, but let me just, if you'll just perhaps bear with me, I want to share just a couple of other things, a little bit about the origin of man. You know, you've all seen this kind of an image, this beguiling progression from the ape all the way through to a fully upright human being. But here we have a guy called Bernard Wood, who is not a Christian, but a leading evolutionist. And he says, our progress from ape to human looks so smooth, so tidy. It's a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let go. But it is an illusion. You see, he's admitting it's a lie. But how often do you see that in biology textbooks? How often do you see it used in TV documentaries and wherever else? And this afternoon, Rod Walsh shared a few of these lies that have been told about human evolution. Piltdown man, discovered apparently in 1912. And then, in 1953, 41 years later, it was exposed as a fraud, but only because of a deathbed confession. It turned out to be parts of a human skull cap and orangutan's jawbone, and the teeth filed to make them look worn and so on. A complete fraud. Nebraska man, there he is, looking a bit kind of getting there slowly, isn't he? But all based on an extinct pig's tooth. Now you might think, well, hang on a minute, that was a long time ago, but friends, it's still happening. Front page of Time magazine. Meet your newfound ancestor, a chimp-like forest creature that stood upright and walked 5.8 million years ago. Now note the precision with which this is not 5.7, but 5.8. So this obviously is a very scientific and accurately calculated number. Not. But it all turns out to have been based on a single toe bone. So when you look at what was collected, here are the collections of bones, 4 different groups, and the bone in question is this one. As a matter of fact, that little collection of 6 bones is actually one, looking at that bone from 3 different perspectives, their photographs and their drawings. But it looks like it's a lot of evidence, doesn't it? But look at what they say in the article. Hominid status is claimed on the basis of a single toe bone found, get this, 18 kilometres from the rest and in a different stratum. Not only that, the other pieces were collected from 4 locations spread over an arc 15 kilometres long. Now friends, I think this is desperation. This is not science. Either that or this guy was the world's first suicide bomber. But anyway. And here is Boxgrove man. This is a find made in the UK. And they say here that this is Europe's oldest known man. He lived 500,000 years ago, ate elephant, and was tall and robust, British archaeologists said yesterday. And what did they find? Well, a little piece of rather modern-looking shin bone. Someone suggested it's a shin to tell a lie, but anyway. Now you would have heard of Lucy. Now Lucy was our claimed ancestor. This is an Australopithecus afarensis, and there's a recreation of Lucy in the Natural History Museum in London. And you'll notice that Lucy has very human-like hands and human-like feet. And she's kind of on the way to looking like a human female. The face has got a little way to go yet, but anyway, we're getting there. But it's interesting to see what was actually found. And these are the bones. And you'll notice, however, there are no hand bones, apart from a couple here, and no feet. And yet, in the absence of evidence, this is what they constructed as the reconstruction of Lucy. A lot of imagination. Well, since then, more complete skeletons of Australopithecus afarensis have been found. And so what do they now know? Well, they've discovered that the fingers were curved, not like human fingers. The toes were curved, not like human toes. It had heavily muscled hands and feet. The knee structure was compatible with life in trees. The pelvis muscle attachments were consistent with a stooped posture. It could have walked upright, but it would have been bent-kneed and stooped like this. What else did they find? The teeth, well, very ape-like. And the balance organ and the bony labyrinth in the skull was similar to that of the great apes, but did not walk upright like humans. So the conclusion from the secular community now is that Lucy were knuckle walkers, Lucy's type, similar to gorillas. So the conclusion is that Lucy was in fact was a knuckle walking ape and not intermediate between humans and the great apes. And I like this quotation. Now, evolution is the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links not seen. But friends, what is really happening? You see, when we look around, what we discover is that life is fading away. Humanity is dying, primarily because of mutations. And in Peter we read, all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall. You see, we are relentlessly accumulating mutations, copying mistakes, generation after generation. It's called genetic entropy. In fact, aging is largely a genetic process. So, if we go back a generation, there were fewer copying mistakes. Go back another generation, there were fewer still. You keep going back, and you get fewer and fewer and fewer, and you know what you end up with? A perfect set of genes. I wonder who they were. Adam and Eve. You see, the genetic evidence is consistent with the Bible. I guess I can say to my children that I am likely to be genetically superior to them. That's the only thing I've got on them. Professor John Sanford, one of the world's leading geneticists, he was the co-discoverer of the gene gun used extensively in agriculture. He gave a talk at a super camp we had way back in January 2009. And he said this: there are at least 100 new mutations per person per generation. Each and every one of us have tens of thousands of bad mutations. 2 to 3% of all babies born have a visible birth defect. 5% of babies born in Australia have a genetic disease. You've heard of Genes for Genes Day, I guess. That's an effort to raise research funds into genetic diseases. There are some 6,000 human Mendelian diseases, meaning genetically inherited diseases. And geneticists agree we're degenerating. But friends, what can they say? How can they say to the community, oh, guess what? We've got it wrong. Actually, we're not evolving upwards, we're devolving downwards. What loss of credibility would there be? You see, they're mute because of the belief system that grips our society today. So what is the conclusion of genetic entropy? Well, it tells us that Darwinian evolution is falsified because natural selection cannot even preserve the genome or the DNA, let alone improve it. And guess what? The biblical timescales are confirmed. Mankind cannot have existed for millions of years because we would all be extinct by now. In fact, not even 100,000 years. And Sanford and his team have done some excellent genetic modelling, and it shows this exponential decay in our fitness to live, and how beautifully that matches the ages of the patriarchs after the flood. It's an exponential decay down to what we now have around about 70 or so years. You see, the evidence in science that is observable, remember we shared about science being based on observations this afternoon, observable science confirms the Bible's record of history. We are called on to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, and of course to do it with gentleness and respect. And friends, that's why our ministry exists, to equip people to do that. I talked this afternoon about how to subscribe to the Creation magazine. And if you see our people up the back, remember, for a 1-year subscription you'll get that Fallout DVD. For a 3-year subscription you'll get Fallout plus a choice of one of 2 others. Dr. Sanford's book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, is available from our website. I don't know if we have it up the back or not. A recording of his talk, The Mystery of Our Declining Genes, is there. A powerful, powerful message. And Evolution's Achilles' Heels, the book and DVD. The book was written by 9 PhD scientists that looked at the so-called strengths of evolution and showed that each of them are in fact weaknesses or Achilles' heels. I had the great privilege of being one of the 9 authors for the chapters in that book. And the DVD interviews 15 PhD scientists in their various disciplines in a very, very well-structured DVD, which makes an excellent basis for a series of studies. But it is a thinking person's DVD. But don't be put off by that. Now, we've all seen documentaries from this man, haven't we? Fantastic photography, brilliant stuff. Somebody once asked Attenborough, why don't you give credit to Almighty God? Good question. So how did he answer? He said this: when creationists talk about God creating, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And I ask them, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is an all-merciful God who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God created this worm that can live in no other way than in an innocent child's eyeball? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. Wow. Good point. You see, he observes extraordinary detail and beauty and intricacy in the world around him, but he also observes suffering and death. And he says, I don't want to have anything to do with a God like that, if there is a God. And you know what? I would probably be in his camp, you know. But there's a flaw, isn't there? You see, he rejects the history book of the universe. He believes that naturalistic account of origins that starts by assuming there's no God and places millions of years of death and suffering before man, instead of reading the true history of the world laid out for us by God clearly, unambiguously, that man brought death into the world. You see, when you understand that, you understand the basis of Christ's redemption for us. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 said, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. What an awesome gospel. What a loving God we have who would do all that for us, for the love of each and every one of us. It's an extraordinary message that we have to bring to this lost and dying world. So friends, just in closing, don't forget this website with a difficult name to remember. Remember that, creation.com. And I just encourage you to get equipped with answers so that you can confidently share your faith and understand it. Let me ask the musicians now if they'll come up, and let's just close with a word of prayer. Father God, we just are in awe at your majesty and power and the beauty and the wonder of your creation. Father, you are beyond our comprehension, and yet, Lord, you love each and every one of us with a love which too is beyond our comprehension. Even us, Lord, you came and died for us. You gave your life for us that we might go free, that we might come in relationship with you, to walk and talk with you on a daily basis, and to know that we have an eternal destiny secured forever in eternity. Father, you have wrought such an extraordinary salvation for us, and we praise and worship you for that tonight. In Jesus' wonderful and precious name, amen.